June 1944. The beaches of Normandy were supposed to be the gateway to victory, but just 6 days after D-Day, that gateway had turned into a graveyard of steel. Sherman tanks, America's pride, were burning in the fields of France. Not from German tigers or panthers, but from something no one had expected: hedgerows. To the untrained eye, they looked harmless, thick walls of earth and roots dividing farmlands. But to Allied tank crews, they were death traps. Every time a Sherman tried to climb over one, its front lifted, exposing its weak underbelly, the softest armor a tank had. And that's when German Panzerfaust struck. One shot, one kill, over and over again. By mid-June, progress had slowed to a crawl. The plan to reach Paris in a week had collapsed. Now every single field was a fortress, every hedgerow another ambush. Morale was crumbling. In the 102nd Cavalry Squadron, Sergeant Curtis Culin, a New Jersey mechanic turned tank commander, had seen enough. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have a college degree, but he understood machines, and he understood that if you couldn't go over something, maybe you were supposed to go through it. At night, under the dim glow of a lantern, Cullen started sketching in his notebook, crude lines, half-crazy ideas, all circling the same thought. Why are we climbing over the damn thing? Why not cut through it? His crew laughed. Cullen's lost it, one joked. Gonna fix the war with a wrench and some scrap. But Cullen wasn't joking. He knew physics, leverage, and force, the quiet mathematics of machinery. And he knew that if he could attach steel teeth to the front of a tank, maybe, just maybe, the tank could rip through centuries of French soil instead of dying on top of it. The next morning, he went straight to his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, with a proposal so wild it sounded like madness. "Sir," he began, "I want to weld steel prongs as like knives to a Sherman's front. We'll use scrap from those German beach obstacles, drive at full speed into a hedgerow and carve right through." Morrison blinked. "You're serious?" "Dead serious, sir. So your plan is to take a tank that's already been hit, weld garbage to the front, and ram a wall of dirt?" "Yes, sir. Because right now we're driving over hedges and getting shot in the belly. My way, we keep the armor forward, and the Germans never get that shot." Morrison was silent for a long moment. It sounded insane, but it also made uncomfortable sense. After a pause, he sighed. "You've got 48 hours, Sergeant. If this kills someone, you'll answer to more than me." Culin saluted. "Understood, sir. I'll make it work." What followed was 2 straight days of smoke, sparks, and sweat. Culin and a handful of welders scavenged the beaches, cutting apart the twisted steel crosses the Germans had left behind, the so-called Czech hedgehogs. They melted, reshaped, and welded the metal into crude but deadly-looking teeth, thick as a man's leg, sharp as a blade ready to chew through the French countryside. By dawn, the prototype was ready. 4 jagged prongs jutted from the front of the Sherman like tusks on some mechanical beast. It looked ridiculous, half pig, half monster. The men called it the Rhino. When Morrison saw it, he shook his head. "Well, Sergeant, either you've built a miracle or a coffin." "We'll find out tomorrow," Cullen replied. That night, Cullen didn't sleep. He replayed every calculation in his mind. The angles, the welds, the weight distribution. What if the prongs snapped off? What if the tank got stuck? What if he'd just built a death trap? But then he remembered the burning Shermans and the men inside them. If this worked, it could save lives. That was worth any risk. At sunrise, they tested it. A small crowd of officers gathered around a 12-foot-high hedgerow, thick with roots and stone. The Rhino rumbled forward, its engine roaring. The soldiers fell silent. Cullen's heart pounded. "Hit it!" Morrison shouted. The Sherman accelerated. 30 tons of steel slamming into 10 centuries of French farmland. The sound was thunder. Earth exploded. Roots snapped. The tank jolted and then slowed, then kept moving. The prongs dug deep, ripping through the hedge like claws. And in seconds it burst through the other side, armor still facing forward, completely unharmed. Silence. Then, cheering. Men shouted, laughed, clapped Cullen on the back. The impossible had just become real. Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters stepped forward, eyes wide. "How many of these can you make?" "As many as you give me welders for, sir." "You'll get 50, and I'm sending this to General Bradley immediately." Morrison grinned. "Congratulations, Sergeant. You just changed the war. But Culin wasn't celebrating yet. One test isn't enough, he said. We need to prove it under fire. The officers exchanged glances. That would mean putting the Rhino into real combat, against live German guns. Morrison nodded slowly. Then that's exactly what we'll do. Tomorrow you ride with the tank, Culin froze. Sir, you mean in it? That's right, Sergeant. If your invention's going to save lives, you'd better be there to see it. Culin nodded. He didn't argue. But as he turned to leave, his hands were shaking. Tomorrow wasn't just another test. Tomorrow would decide whether his idea was genius or suicide. Dawn broke gray and cold over Normandy. A light drizzle turned the fields into mud, and the hedgerows loomed like walls of green stone. Sergeant Curtis Culin climbed into the modified Sherman he'd built with his own hands, the Rhino. Its new steel teeth gleamed wet in the morning mist. Inside, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. The plan was simple on paper but deadly in practice. Led the assault toward a fortified German strongpoint 2 miles ahead. Those hedgerows had stopped every Allied advance for days. If the Rhino failed here, the whole front would stall again. Culin took his seat behind the commander's periscope. Below him sat the crew. Corporal Jake Mitchell at the controls, Sergeant Tom Harrison on the gun, and Private Danny Chen loading shells. They weren't just soldiers today. They were guinea pigs in an experiment that could decide the fate of the Normandy campaign. Ready? Mitchell asked. Culin swallowed hard. Do it! The tank's engine roared to life, echoing through the valley. Rain hissed against the armor. Outside infantry crouched low, watching, waiting. Move out! Morrison's voice barked through the radio. The Rhino lurched forward, treads grinding through mud. Ahead of them, the first hedgerow loomed. Thick, ancient, defiant. Behind it waited a German machine gun nest that had cut down dozens of men in the past week. Steady, Culin said into the intercom. 20-degree angle. Let the prongs bite first. Roger that, Mitchell replied. The tank picked up speed. The ground trembled. Then what impact? A sound like thunder cracked across the field. Earth exploded around them. Inside, the men were thrown against their restraints, teeth rattling. But the welds held. The Rhino pushed forward, prongs digging deep, shredding the roots like paper. Within seconds, they burst through the other side. Harrison didn't hesitate. Target front, he shouted, firing the main gun. A single high-explosive shell slammed into the German position, vaporizing the nest. Silence followed. Then Chen let out a yell, half laugh, half shock. It worked! Holy hell, it worked under fire. Outside, the infantry erupted in cheers, pouring through the breach. For the first time since D-Day, they had a clear path, but there was no time to celebrate. More hedgerows loomed ahead, and behind them, more German guns. Culin steadied his breathing. Keep moving. Don't give them a chance to regroup. The Rhino smashed through another barrier, then another. Each hit sent waves of dirt cascading over the hull. Each breach widened the gap for troops to follow. The 47th Infantry advanced behind them, shouting, firing, pushing forward like a tide that refused to stop. Hours passed like minutes. The radio crackled with reports. Allied armor advancing. Enemy retreating from sector. But the real test was still waiting. Intelligence had warned of a German Panther hiding behind one of the largest hedgerows, its 75mm cannon capable of tearing a Sherman apart from half a mile away. If the Rhino got stuck during the breach, they'd be sitting ducks. Contact front, Harrison called out. Panther, partial cover. Cullen's heart slammed in his chest. They could stop, call for artillery, play it safe. But that wasn't why he'd built this thing. He'd built it to change the rules. Breach the hedge, Culin ordered. Full throttle. Do not stop, Mitchell didn't hesitate. The Rhino accelerated, mud spraying like blood from its treads. The hedgerow rushed toward them, dense, massive, ancient impact. The tank shook violently. Metal groaned. The prongs bit deep, but the hedge refused to break. More power, Culin shouted. Mitchell slammed the throttle forward. The engine screamed, smoke pouring from the exhaust. The prongs tore through the roots one by one until, crack. The wall split open and the Rhino burst through. The Panther was right there, its turret turning, gun swinging toward them. But the Rhino had momentum and surprise. Fire, Culin yelled. Harrison squeezed the trigger. The 75mm gun roared. The shell struck the Panther's side armor. A perfect hit. The German tank shuddered, fire blooming from its hatches. The crew bailed out, hands raised, faces pale with shock. Culin exhaled slowly. The hedgerow that had stopped armies was gone. The impossible beaten. Infantry surged forward through the new breach, chasing the retreating Germans. An American officer ran up to the Rhino, shouting over the engine noise. "Sergeant Culin, I don't know what the hell you built, but it just turned 3 days of blood into 2 hours of victory." Culin climbed out of the hatch, legs trembling. He looked back at the hedgerow, now a jagged, smoking hole. His invention had survived. More importantly, so had his crew. Captain Morrison arrived moments later, radio pressed to his ear. "Division just called," he said, grinning. "General Bradley wants to see you." They're calling it the Culin cutter. "Orders for 5,000 units went out an hour ago." Culin blinked. 5,000? "That's right. You just gave the entire army a new weapon." For the first time in weeks, hope returned to Normandy. Welding crews worked day and night, fitting the new cutters onto every Sherman they could find. Soon, the once-trapped Allied armor began to move like a tide through the French countryside, tearing through centuries-old barriers that had once stopped them cold. Culin had done it. A mechanic's idea, and born in desperation, built from scrap metal, had changed the course of a campaign. That night, as the Rhino sat parked under the stars, Culin leaned against its hull, listening to the engine cool. Private Chen approached, holding 2 tin mugs of coffee. "You did it, Sarge," he said. Culin smiled faintly. "We did it." He looked at the steel prongs, still caked in dirt and roots. "They'll call it genius now," he murmured. "But it started as madness," Chen nodded. "Sometimes that's what genius looks like." Within days of that first battle, welding sparks lit up every Allied camp in Normandy. Tank depots turned into workshops. Engineers, mechanics, even infantrymen with basic tools were bolting and welding steel prongs to every Sherman they could get their hands on. The Culin cutter had gone from a wild idea to an army-wide revolution. General Omar Bradley himself visited one of the modification sites. He watched the crews at work, cutting scrap steel, welding, testing, moving tanks through mud. In the middle of it all stood Sergeant Curtis Culin, sleeves rolled up, torch in hand, teaching other soldiers how to fit his design. Bradley approached, grinning. "So you're the man who got my army moving again." Culin snapped to attention, wiping soot from his face. "Just a mechanic, sir." Bradley laughed. "No, Sergeant. You're an engineer who didn't wait for permission." The general's report later called the device one of the most effective field innovations of the war. Culin received the Legion of Merit, a field promotion and, more importantly, the respect of the soldiers who now rolled through hedgerows without fear. But Culin himself never looked comfortable with the attention. He preferred the noise of the torch to the applause of officers. When reporters asked about his invention, he just said, "It wasn't genius. It was necessity." By August 1944, the once impenetrable hedgerows of Normandy were nothing more than shredded earth. Allied forces poured into open country, racing toward Paris. Where tanks had once been easy targets, now they moved with unstoppable rhythm. Breach, fire, advance, repeat. The cutters weren't just tools. They'd become symbols of momentum, of American ingenuity under pressure. Some crews added nicknames to their tanks: Hedgehog, Root Ripper, Rhino 2. Others decorated the prongs with chalk messages. Culin's Teeth, Berlin Express. Even the Germans noticed. Captured reports described enemy armor now passing through hedgerows without exposing vulnerable areas. Method unknown. When they finally realized what was happening, it was too late. Their defensive strategy had been broken by a handful of welders and a sergeant who refused to give up. But Culin's work wasn't over. He spent the following months moving from unit to unit, training welders, improving designs, and listening to feedback from tank crews. He welcomed every suggestion. One crew suggested adding a 5th center prong for thicker hedges. Another added serrated edges that bit deeper into roots. A third designed a clearing bar to scrape away packed mud. Culin tested them all, refining his design on the battlefield, turning crude ingenuity into precision engineering. When asked how he came up with improvements so fast, he'd shrug. "Simple," he'd say. "The war doesn't wait for blueprints." By winter, the cutters had found new uses. Tanks used them to smash through stone walls in towns, clearing paths for infantry. In the Battle of the Bulge, they broke through frozen trees, blocking narrow mountain roads. In deep snow, they worked like plows, carving trenches for vehicles and troops. One after-action report described a Sherman using its cutter to push a disabled German tank off a road, saving an entire column from ambush. It read, "The prongs acted like a lever. The enemy tank moved and our advance continued." Culin read that report in silence, a faint smile touching his face. He had built something meant for one job, but it had become a multi-tool of survival. Yet with every success came something darker. Culin couldn't shake the images of burning Shermans, of the men who died before his idea was born. Every time he saw a tank push through a hedgerow unharmed, he felt pride and guilt. He confided in his old welder friend, Eddie Kowalski. "Maybe I built something that made killing easier." Eddie looked at him, tired but firm. "No, Sarge. You built something that made living possible." Still, the weight never left him. He began turning down interviews. When a war correspondent asked what it felt like to be a hero, he said softly, "Heroes don't build tools. They use them." By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces crossed into Germany, nearly every Sherman in Europe bore the unmistakable prongs of the Culin cutter. It had become standard equipment. The U.S. Army had even added it to official production lines, proof that one man's field modification had changed armored warfare. But for Culin, the war's end brought a strange emptiness. He'd helped win a battle, maybe even shorten the war. But what did a mechanic do when there were no more hedgerows to cut through? He returned home to New Jersey that fall, medals in a box, hands still scarred from welding. He opened a small auto shop fixing cars, trucks, tractors. To the locals, he was just Kurt, the quiet mechanic who never talked much about the war. Only a few old veterans knew the truth. Decades passed. The world changed. But in military museums across America and Europe, old Sherman tanks still stood, steel prongs rusting but intact. Plaques beneath them read, "Cullin's hedge cutter, designed in the field, Normandy, 1944. In 1984, a historian named David Carter found him, an old man in a small garage polishing a carburetor. He'd tracked Culin down for a book on battlefield innovation. "Mr. Culin," Carter asked, "do you realize your invention shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks? That it saved thousands of lives?" Culin thought for a long moment before replying. "I wasn't special," he said quietly. "I was just a guy who saw a problem and had a chance to fix it. The real miracle is that somebody listened," Carter later wrote. His invention was a triumph of common sense in a world gone mad. A torch, some scrap steel, and the courage to try. Today, every time a soldier learns field improvisation, every time a mechanic rigs a solution under fire, they echo the spirit of that mad mechanic from Normandy. He didn't change the world with money or rank. He changed it with stubbornness, courage, and a welding torch. And maybe that's why history remembers him. Not as an engineer, not as a general, but as the man who looked at an impossible problem and said, "Let's cut through it."